So, we missed last week on this book, but, it is what it is. That's where we're at. Um, can't be helped sometimes. So, we're going to go through chapters 31 through 34 this time. Depending on how my voice is feeling, I might even go farther. We've still got quite a bit of this book to go. We haven't been reading a whole lot of it each time, so maybe try to step it up a little bit. All right, so we're on 31, and it's titled Flesh Blizzard. Zoe stood with snow falling in her face, staring up at the tower. "I don't understand," she said. "How did we end up back here?" The Whiffid didn't answer. This time, though, any response would have been gratuitous. She knew why they were here. Somewhere inside the paddock, they'd lost their sense of direction to a Sith illusion, crude but effective, and now they were back out where they'd begun. Then she saw the figures. They were poised like carved grotesques along the uppermost walls of the tower, life-size statues illuminated by the irregular, stammering red glow from the top. At first she thought that was all they were, statues, gargoyles, except they were moving. Crawling, swarming over the others' backs like some hideously overgrown version of the flesh-eating bosky beetles she'd seen aboard Tulk's ship. And when the light caught their faces, she could see that they were, or at least once had been, human. Their uniforms, which Zoe realized must be the black robes and tunics of the Sith acolyte, were tattered and ragged, and they billowed behind them in the screeching wind. She watched as a cluster of them began to clutch and lever their way closer to the tower's viewports. One of them threw back its head and began to hammer one fist on the surface with awful ape-like determination. "What are they doing?" Tulk grunted, looking for a way in. "Why?" A scream came shearing down from above, the single compressed blast that she remembered from inside the supposedly deserted barracks, and the bounty hunter stepped back, hissing some obscenity under his breath. Before he could finish, one of the things fell from far above, whistling down in front of her. She looked back at Tulk. He was gone. Zoe jerked back and looked up again. Overhead, another of the things on the tower had detached itself and was plummeting downward like a renegade slab of darkness itself, some broken chunk of the universe, falling fast, still screaming, through the flying snow. The screaming thing slammed to the ground on all fours, and even though its back was to her, Zoe could see the hole where its uniform was ripped open to reveal the architecture of exposed ribs and scooped out portions of the vertebrae. Snowy air whistled through the hole, and she saw clumped loops of intestine, blackened with a crust of dried blood, flapping alongside the torn fabric. Part of its lungs seemed to have been jolted loose in the fall, leaving one of them dangling, inflating and deflating raggedly like some small panting animal. Tulk. It drove him down into the snow when it landed on him, and now it's trying to get him out. The second thing stalked over toward the snowdrift, its head slightly inclined, seeking an angle of attack. Zoe heard another scream from above, and the two corpses in the Sith uniforms shrieked back their answering cry. Tulk's arm burst up and out of the snow, holding his spear, and thrust it forward. An instant later, the Sith thing on top of him reared back, staggering blindly, the tip of his spear embedded in its face. Its right cheek was a suppurating cave-in of demolished bone structure. The long shaft protruded from its head like a clumsy, oversized horn. Tulk sat up, spitting snow. "Juddering yankwit," he snarled. "This should teach you to jump on me." He knocked the thing backward with one foot, held it down, and jerked his spear loose from its face. Then, using both hands, he brought the spear tip down hard, directly into the thing's already demolished torso, hard enough to pulverize the spine, cutting it completely in half. The upper and lower segments squirmed listlessly in the snow, then fell still. "Hold on." Breathing hard, he glanced up at Zoe. Where's the other one? I don't... Down! And without waiting for her to comply, he fired the spear directly at her. Zoe dropped to her knees, feeling his spear whisk through her hair, just across the top of her scalp. From behind, something landed on top of her, a landslide of meat, flattening the air from her chest, blocking out sight and hearing, driving her into the snow. She felt cold, clutching hands, and the sticky, oily drip of partially coagulated fluid seeping down over the skin of her neck, where her collar didn't quite cover her flesh. It, too, began to scream, and then the scream broke off with a choked, flapping noise. It was followed by a series of sharp chops, and the flapping stopped. "Get up!" Tulk's voice, muffled, came from above her. Zoe dragged herself upright. The bounty hunter was standing in front of her. The severed head of the thing he'd just decapitated hung from the top of the spear at an almost jaunty angle, the tip jetting upward through its broken jaw to protrude from one empty eye socket. The gray lips sagged, dangling thick strands of ropey pink drool, and its one remaining eye wobbled back and forth, somehow managing to look both sly and stupid beneath the swollen lid. "A teenager," Zoe said. 17, 18 at the most. She watched the yellow eye. "It's still looking at me." "They're dead." Tulk shrugged down at the other body he'd left in the snow and shook his head. "Forget about it." There was another klaxon-like blast of noise from up above. Zoe looked up as far as she could. It was like a rallying call. The snow-choked darkness that surrounded the tower was suddenly filled with falling bodies, more than she could count. They came tumbling in twos and threes from the top of the tower, eyes blazing, teeth shining, slamming into the ground in every direction, some almost close enough to grab her from the point of impact. They brought their screams with them so that they seemed to land on a cushion of sound. In front of her, Tulk fell into a fighting stance. "Jedi trained you to fight, didn't they?" She nodded once. "Then fight them." The Sith things were all around them now. Their screams were constant, ululating everywhere. The air itself seemed to stiffen with their shrieks. Zoe realized that she couldn't see Tulk anymore. "There's no way we can take them all." And then something else spoke. "Yes, you can." Zoe paused, brought up short by the voice. It sounded true and strong and clarion clear. At first she thought it was the orchid. Then she realized that she was hearing the voice of her brother Rojo. "But that's impossible. He's nowhere near here." And it wasn't really Rojo. The words were coming from her memory, from the storehouse of encouragement that he'd given her in the past, when she'd been training at the Jedi Academy. There had been times when she'd felt exhausted and hopeless, and he'd spoken to her, encouraged her to stand up, to be strong, and be true. "Listen, Hestizo, the Jedi taught you much more than simply how to fight. They taught you how to live within the Force, and uphold the bond that you share with it." With these words, Hestizo Trace, looks like we're getting ready to start into an ad. Hestizo Trace felt a deep and voluminous feeling of rightness booming through her. And there it goes. So I'll go ahead and ramble on about nothing here for a little bit while the ad goes on. It looks like it's 20 seconds from being done. So here's the rest of my chat while I'm at it here. Anyway, so okay. It says we're not back yet, but I see on another screen that we are. So I don't know. We'll just go ahead and pick up at the beginning of that paragraph. With these words, Hestizo Trace felt a deep and voluminous feeling of rightness booming through her. At the Jedi Temple, she'd heard others in the discipline trying to describe the experience, saying it was like this or like that, but for her it was simply the experience of being alive, of wild and ecstatic belief, but amplified. All the encumbrances of frustration and anxiety fell away, filling her very essence with an entire universe of pure, sustaining energy. She looked around again and saw the Sith things crashing to the ground on all sides of her, raising their heads and opening their mouths, and everything slowed down. Get, Tulk was saying, one arm sludging back to pluck a meter-long arrow from his quiver, moving so slowly that he seemed to be underwater. Zoe sprang up into the air like a woman moving through a gallery of wax figures. She came down just behind one of the Sith things, grabbed its greasy, partially decayed skull in both hands from the back, and wrenched it hard to the left. The cervical spine popped and gave with a crunch, the entire cranium coming loose as she ripped it free from the shoulders. The head was still screaming as she threw it underhand into the next shambling thing, hitting it hard enough to knock it back into the side of the tower. A third she grabbed by the throat and crotch, hoisting it up and pile driving it straight upward in the direction it had come. Behind her, she heard the twang as Tolk's arrow finally left the bowstring. Without glancing back, Zoe readied out. And lifted the flying arrow out. Oh, okay. There are typos. So reached out. I wondered why it looked like such a weird word. Reached out and lifted the flying arrow out of the air. She did this effortlessly, without a thought, like someone taking a book from a shelf. Behind her, across the depths of motionless snowflakes, Tolk stood with his lips still curling to form the last part of his first word, while the 5 remaining Sith things perched like statues, barely moving in various aspects of attack. Springing forward, snapping the arrow in two, Zoe buried the halves of the shaft in 2 of their skulls, hard enough to impale them permanently together, face to face, like horrific lovers melded for all eternity. She grabbed the arm of the grinning, mossy-faced Sith acolyte, who appeared to have gnawed through his own lips, and the interior of his mouth up to his hard palate. Twist, pop. The arm came free at the elbow, and she swung it down like a club on the skull of the walking corpse in front of him. She sensed events moving faster now, her hold on the situation loosening again. The snowflakes were becoming unstuck from the air, starting to confetti down in reckless profusion. The Sith thing that she'd flung upward earlier was finally coming back down. As the last of the things shambled toward her, she heard a dull whacking thump, the kindling sharp crack of a dozen fractured bones. Down, Tulk finished, only then seeming to realize that the arrow was gone from his bow and that the Sith things were all on the ground now, torn apart. He looked up at Zoe, his nostrils twitched. Leave any for me? She pointed at the 2 bodies writhing in the snow between them. Tulk drew his spear and raised it up, and rammed it down through them both. His eyes were blazing, saturated with red, almost glutted with pleasure, and there was no misinterpreting the grin that twisted over his face. Zoe thought that she'd never seen any living thing, human or otherwise, extract such shameless pleasure from the act of killing. Hestizo. This time the voice of the orchid was unmistakable. Hestizo, come. She stopped and listened, felt herself smiling, overcome by a sudden surge of hope. So from somewhere in the tailing snow, I'm sure that means it's supposed to be falling snow, Tulk was staring at her. What is it? He wanted to know. The Murakami, she said. It's alive. I thought you said, I know, but I can hear it. It's calling me. Tulk scowled, unconvinced. Where? She peered back through the blizzard, pointing. The library. And that's the end of 31. So we'll jump right on into 32, which is titled Flame Town. It was a pleasure to burn. The Nettie saw it now latched onto this simple tautology. I'm not sure if that's a typo or not. In a way that he had never grasped anything in his long life. Within moments after Scabrous had left him here with his mission, To call out to the Jedi to summon her here, everything within his ageless wooden mind had begun to grow wonderfully, gloriously clear. And oh, it was a pleasure to burn. Clutching rows of hollow books with one long branch hand, the librarian flung them into the rising flames, and the flames surged higher. After the Sith Lord had bitten him, Dale Liss had endured a brief but agonizing spasm of physical weakness and distress, the pain compounded by the brooding fear that had been growing in his mind throughout the day. This was what he'd felt outside the walls of his sanctuary. The sickness was in here now. It had violated the barriers of safety and security, and it was inside him, running through his roots, spreading through his branches and leaves. And the sickness was laughing. At first that laughter had sounded so mocking, so bitter and cold, that the Nettie had only cowered before it. Even the Sith themselves couldn't match the dark malevolence in its voice. "Old fool," it had said, "foolish old creature, your life has been wasted here among your books." The Nettie had tried to respond, to tell it no, that these scrolls and texts were his life, but the sickness hadn't shown the slightest bit of interest in that. It had more to say, and the Nettie realized that he was a captive audience. "It's not too late," the sickness said. "I have given you new life and a new purpose, and you will know it if you seek my face. Will you, old tree? Will you seek my face?" "What is it?" the Nettie asked. "What is your face?" "Mine is a face of blood and fire." And with those words everything changed. Looking around now at the contents of the library, the countless scrolls and ancient texts, the holdings and stacks that he had spent his lifetime accumulating here, organizing and cataloging for 1,000 years or more, he saw them for what they were: fuel. "The flesh is our fuel," the sickness counseled, and its voice was like thunder now. "And the books are our fuel, and this planet is our fuel. All things are fuel. They exist only so that they can be consumed by us." "Yes, yes." "They are meat for the beast." "Yes." "And the beast is you." "Yes." From there, the Nettie discovered that everything came to him with oily, gratifying ease. Giving himself up utterly to the sickness, he had started the fire without the slightest hesitation. There were years of fuel here, plenty here to burn. Within minutes the central wing of the library was ablaze, and the seeping, maddened grin of the Nettie shone with reflected orange firelight. Although there were no mirrors here, no means of seeing his reflection, Dale Liss knew that the sickness had changed him. Whole chunks of its once proud bark had begun molting, dropping off in patches, its branches curling and blackening, dripping with thick, foul-smelling drainage that gathered around its roots. But the most profound transformation had happened within him. The sickness had taught him. He had sought its face, and now the Nettie laughed into the fire. Its once kind eyes were twisted now, tightened into knotty slits. Its mouth coiled into a wide, salivating grin as it spoke out in the voice of the orchid. "Come, Hestizo Trace. Hurry, come to the library." More scrolls, more hollow books, tumbling into the fire. Sap boiled in the coals. "I await your arrival eagerly. I wish to see you here. I have urgent need of you." He stopped and turned, branches whispering. She was already on her way. And that's the end of 32. A very short one compared to the last one. So 33 is called Redwall. "Looked bigger on the hollow," Mag said, his voice muffled by his hand. He and Rat and the others were all standing in front of the wall, covering their noses and mouths. The end of the tunnel was filled with a smell so rancid that it almost transcended the definition of the word. In the single breath that Rat had inadvertently sucked in without covering his lips, he'd actually been able to taste it on the back of his tongue and the roof of his mouth. It was the horribly organic, ripe rot reek of once living tissue whose life force had evacuated it, leaving only a mass of stinking weight. "What's it made of?" Mags muttered. "Looks like scavenged metal debris. Metal doesn't stink like this. It's not just metal." So what is it? Kendra asked. Well, Rot pointed at a white blade-like shaft sticking out. I'm pretty sure that's a shin bone. Human? Rot nodded. Hartwig swallowed. It took him a few tries. Gah! Looks, Rot started to say and stopped. He was going to say partially digested and decided that that observation probably wouldn't bring anything helpful to the conversation. If the expressions of the others were any indication, they were holding just this side of gastric mutiny. The exit's on the other side, Kendra said, and activated her lightsaber. Hold on, Rot turned and looked back. He'd felt something. Not much more than a ripple in the fabric of the Force, but he'd long ago learned to trust such quirks of perception as far more meaningful than anything gleaned by eyes and ears. He shot a glance at Mags. Lightsaber, now! Instantly Mags joined him, and Kendra and Rot pointed silently into a pool of shadow just beyond a bank of massive metal cases that looked as though they'd been turned into storage for droid parts. Something was moving visibly on the other side of the storage bins, and an instant later it came staggering into view. What in the name? Hartwig said. It was the first thing he'd said since the confrontation with Kendra over the lightsaber. What's wrong with him? What's wrong? Mags made a sick noise. What's right? Rot recognized the Sith acolyte, making his way toward them, but only barely. He was the fifth year known as Rucker. The left side of Rucker's face had been ripped cleanly away to reveal the gleaming infrastructure of cheekbone and jaw. His... it's another typo. I'm not sure. His something eyes quivered in their sockets like a pair of infected red eggs. He was naked except for a pair of black breeches torn open at the front, and the massive bulge of his swollen abdomen was so badly distended that he could hardly carry it forward. It stared at them for a long beat. Then it threw back its head, jaws wrenching open, and screamed. Kill it, Hartwig said. What are you waiting for? Still screaming, the Rucker thing whirled and staggered toward the wall. Rot saw its mouth open even wider, the mandible popping loose from its hinges completely now, and the scream became a gargled gush as it disgorged a flood of reddish gray directly onto the barrier, its belly shrinking visibly as it did so. Watching helplessly, Rot felt a nauseating roundelay of terrors swerve through him, like the shadow of some far distant flying object. A late coming refusal, despite everything he'd seen so far, to fully accept this monstrosity at face value. Am I seeing this? He thought. Am I really? Still dribbling, the thing flung its hands up to pack the mass together, working it tightly into the wall. Almost despite himself, Rot thought of the cosmowasps he'd read about, and the way they built nests by filling their bellies and regurgitating the pulp. We're pulp, too, he thought, and the smell hit him in the most vulnerable part of his own stomach, making his gorge rise. The only thing that stopped him from losing total control of his gag reflex was the even more potent realization that the thing was swiveling back toward them, moving much faster now. Take him down, he heard Kendra murmur, almost to herself, and she, Mags, and Rot himself advanced in a single coordinated strike. Kendra sliced its head off with one sweep, while Mags took out its legs. Rot's blow slashed down the front of the body, cleaving it almost perfectly down the middle. Less than 5 seconds later, the Rucker thing's corpse lay on the floor, drawn and quartered, still twitching. What happened to the others? Mags breathed, gesturing at the empty space. Good question, Rot said. It's a dead end here. Where'd they go? Forget it, Kendra turned to the wall. Let's get to work on this. Rot nodded but didn't move. His gaze went back to the steel droid bins near the shadowy area where the thing had originated. He was still thinking about the scream it had let out, high and shrill like the blast of a living air horn. What if it had been a signal to the others, some kind of One of the steel droid bins fell over with a clang, and Ra'at saw. The students of the Sith Academy of Odassar Foston were gathered there after all, had been here the entire time. They'd just been waiting in silence, watching. How many? Mags murmured. 10, Ra'at said. Maybe 12. The silence exploded in a scream, and the things came spilling forward in one coordinated wave, surging into the open tunnel like a single organism. Precision killing box, Kendra snapped. Right and left. She flicked a hand at Hartwig and Mags. Get us through that wall. Ra'at broke right as directed, letting his lightsaber lead him like a natural extension of his will. He pivoted and swung it down into the head of the first Sith thing that he came to, splitting its skull down to the tonsils. But its hands flung up blindly toward him like a pair of carrion birds, and it kept fighting. Turning, he came up from below and took out its legs just above the knees, leaving the thing in a slimy mess of its own dissolution. 2 more came at him, and he chopped them down with an absolute economy of motion. To the right, to the left, behind, move, move, move. Ra'at unplugged his mind and let his training take over. It was just like the drills in Master Hraken's pain pipe. He'd already begun to see the fight through the mirror-bright lens of a warrior, reducing the battle to a sequence of movements, like a series of doors he had to pass through to get to the other side. The things were screaming around him again, that pulsing, deliberate scream. Like the smell, it blanketed everything and made his skull feel as if it was going to pop. As he chopped another of the things in half, a white-hot shock of pain sprang up through his right shoulder. His hand went numb, just like that. The last 3 fingers dead around the handle of the lightsaber, and he spun around, snatching it from the air with his left hand before it hit the floor. Everything was happening with crazy, tricked-out speed, and he both saw and didn't see the thing that had attached itself to his biceps, grinning up as its incisors raked his flesh. Blood splashed around its lips like a tawdry lipstick. Kendra flashed into his peripheral vision and thrust her blade crossways through the thing's upper thorax, slashing it down in a meaty spray. Its jaws stayed locked on Ra'at's arm until Ra'at swung his own blade down on top of it, working left-handed, cutting the thing's head apart. Across the tunnel, he glimpsed Mags hacking his own hole through the group. His blade a fan-like blur, but the tide of bodies was too thick. If they kept coming like this, the things would have him cornered. Ra'at saw the black oval of Mag's mouth shouting something, but he couldn't make out what it was. We're losing, Ra'at thought, and then, how can we be losing? A sudden crash of electricity exploded across the cave. Ra'at saw one of the Sith things go ragdolling backward into the wall as if it had been jerked away on invisible wires. Now Ra'at could smell the ozone in the air, along with the unmistakably smoky odor of burned hair and skin. In front of him, Hartwig lunged into view, eyes bulging, his forehead a map of veins, but the look on his face was pure confusion. That's not possible, Ra'at thought. Only Sith Masters can use Force lightning. How... Stand back, a voice shouted, and when Ra'at looked behind Hartwig, he saw Master Hraken standing there. Hraken's arms were thrust out, with both hands extended. Down, now! Mags and Kendra had taken down 3 more of the things between them and stepped over the bodies as the combat master flung his hands up and outward, hurling out streams of Force lightning. The tunnel shuddered, erupting with an electrical firestorm so intense that for an instant Ra'at couldn't see past it. He smelled his own scorched eyelashes. Even after he shut his eyes, the after-image of the cave, the bodies, and the others lay imprinted on his corneas in bleeding, plaid patterns of red and black. The Sith Master kept his hands in front of him, muscles straining, jaw clenched with fury. For a moment he disappeared yet again behind a vast crackling hood of electricity. It shattered the length of the tunnel with a massive ear-rending crack that rocked the entire structure to its foundation and sent loose particles of building materials skittering down the walls. Rot rubbed his eyes, waiting for what he saw to make sense. Part of the permasteel ceiling above his head was torn loose by electrical shock and dangled on a slew of cables. All around him the floor was filled with smoking corpses, severed limbs and heads still writhing as if trying to find a means of knitting themselves back together. Some of them were actively on fire. Others lay blind, their eyes cooked in their sockets. The heat from the force lightning had literally melted off their skin, leaving webs and rivulets of liquefied tissues trickling from piles of blackened bones, while the things shifted and squirmed, trying to stand, and collapsed back into their own murk. In front of the foul-smelling wall, Kraken stood, trembling. A tendon twitched and jigged in his jaw, and Rot saw that the Sith Master had bitten his lip hard enough to draw blood. "Through this way," he said. Kindra pointed to the wound on Rot's arm. "How bad is it?" "Not bad." "Did one of those things do that to you?" "I'm fine." Rot tore a scrap of his pant leg loose and started hurriedly tying it around his upper arm as a makeshift tourniquet, but the blood was already soaking through the fabric, sluicing down his elbow to his forearm with alarming eagerness. Kindra was looking at that, too, along with Mags and Hartwig and Master Kraken, and Rot realized the power dynamic of the group had already shifted. As quickly as the battle had ended, he, Rot, had become a liability, weight to be earned or cut loose. Out of the game just like that. I can fight just as well with my left," Rot said weakly. "You all did." Kindred just nodded, her face inscrutable, a map of unspoken strategy. Master Kraken said nothing, didn't even seem to be paying attention. None of the others spoke either. Rot ignited his lightsaber again in his left hand and swung it down on top of the wall that the things had built there, slashing deep into the pile of scrap metal and congealed viscera, driving it home, carving out a massive chunk of debris and kicking it loose. It dropped to the floor with a soggy clunk. "See?" he said. None of them commented. Next to him, on either side, Kindra and Mags also fell to work, cutting into the wall. Rod attacked his part of it as if he were still working alone. The smell of cooked meat was stronger than ever, and the pain in his right arm had become a dull, pounding drumbeat. He tried to put it all out of his head, to no avail. He thought of Nictor, how fast he had changed after Jura had bitten him. They would leave him behind, too, unless he showed them that he could still fight. Use the Force. Let the dark side strengthen you. Yet at the same time, something cautioned him about using the Force in his current state of mind. Something told him it was a bad idea. No, not just a terrible idea. Who knew what he might be invoking if he summoned it now? "Was it your state of mind? What is your state of mind right now?" a voice inside asked. "Dying. I'm dying." No, that was crazy. It was a flesh wound. He'd lost some blood, yes, but he was young and strong, trained, conditioned. He'd suffered worse injuries in the pain chamber, for that matter, even today. What if those things were infected? Rot realized that he was too dizzy to stand. A clammy layer of sweat had already crept over his forehead, one or two drops venturing down the small of his back. His vision broke into a series of yellowing ochre bands and shadows streaking through everything, staining it. He couldn't breathe. It felt as though someone had slammed a Durasteel restraining band across his chest, the pain shooting down his left arm. Gasping, he fell to his knees, shut his eyes. There was the desire to scream, but he couldn't muster a breath. Helpless, no longer having a choice, he invoked the power of the Sith alchemy, the Force itself. "Abide in me now. Fill me with the strength to stand and fight to..." It smashed into him at full volume, a vast black wave, torrential beyond all reckoning. Too late, Rot realized, what he'd invited into his brain. It might have learned to mimic the Force. It might have answered as a Force, but it was not the Force. Rot shuddered. The others were all staring at him now. It didn't matter. In a penultimate moment of clarity, he could actually see a skeletal black fist clamping over his heart, squeezing it until the muscle hurt. He could feel his body shutting down, whole systems crashing, blood pressure and respiration failing, as this contaminated version of the Force took over. Mine now, the sickness said, mine, body and soul. Not killing him, transforming him. Ra'at felt a dark, orchestral surge of relief rushing through him. Released, he felt weightless, towering, godlike. A horrific smile gnarled over his face. He began to weep big bloody tears of gratitude, running down his cheeks and dribbling off his chin. I can scream now, he thought. Oh, thank you, I will scream. And they will hear me. Bless you, I can scream and they will know how it feels to have an entire galaxy spread out like an open grave at my feet. The thing that had been Ra'at jerked its jaws wide. In that instant he saw all things, a pyramid as black as the tide that had obliterated all conscious thought, a thing resting in a pair of pale hands. All at once he knew his place in the galaxy. He knew everything, and he screamed, and as he did he saw Combat Master Hraken standing directly in front of him with his hands outstretched. Goodbye, Ra'at, Hraken said. Ra'at lunged forward. A white-hot explosion of force lightning exploded through him, and he knew no more. And that is the end of 33. So, 34 is titled Reboot. We'll see how long this one is. In the end, it took Tulk less than a minute to realize how much trouble he was truly in. The Whippet had never believed in fate or any kind of mystic galactic justice. In his experience, whatever happened, happened. The innocent suffered while evil thrived, and to the victors went the spoils. Even so, when his own personal circumstances went from bad to worse, he couldn't help wondering if this were some kind of cosmic comeuppance for abandoning the Jedi at the library. She'd been so certain that the flower was summoning her from inside there. Maybe it had been, but Tulk saw no advantage in going in after it, not when he could return to his ship and put this whole forsaken planet in the past. And so he'd let her go alone. After all, he owed the Jedi girl nothing. All right, she had saved him, but he'd saved her at least once as well, and that made them even, didn't it? A new kind of darkness had risen up from the landscape now, like some night within the night, so that the Academy's snow-swept ruins glowed faintly in what little light emanated from within them. In the distance, Tulk heard screams. They were not random. These screams, they rose up and swooped down, oscillating in the wind, rising from different directions. Yet it was the silence in between that made him the most uneasy. He thought about the things that had dropped from the tower and how many of them seemed to be out there now, screaming into the storm. Tulk gripped his spear, checked his bow, counted his arrows, and listened to the screams grow louder, closer. With numbers like those, he couldn't help but wonder how many he would encounter on his way back to the Miracaw. He didn't have to wait long. He was detouring around a long, curved, hangar-like structure on the western outskirts of the Academy's grounds when they came at him. Crushing waves, one from either side, poured in on his right and left. Tulk smelled them, heard their screams and lurching stomp of their advance. Seconds before they would have ripped him limb from limb. He'd already kicked open the hatchway behind him and dived inside, pivoting to get his first look at the high, brightly lit, curved rib structure that surrounded him. The students must have used this place, he thought. Some wit had left a handmade sign painted over the entranceway. It read, "Welcome to the Pain Pipe." Tulk looked around. It appeared to be some kind of training simulation chamber, a wide, high space full of elaborately machined devices that protruded from the floors and walls, even down from the ceiling pillars. Pinions pinions, retracted coils, and battering rams. But that quick impression was all that Tulk was able to absorb before the hatch burst open behind him, allowing the flood of bodies to come spewing into the space with him. The Whiffid's evolutionary process had optimized his killing skills. Now he called upon the full extent of his genetic heritage. The hatchway forced the things to enter singly, and Tulk brought the first and second ones down with arrows, firing point blank into the space between their eyes with enough force to embed their skulls directly into the walls. The arrows alone didn't stop them, but they held the things down long enough that he could charge forward and gouge their heads off with his spear. The headless corpses dropped to the floor with a gurgle, while the heads hung in place from the walls, gnashing and twitching and rolling their eyes like hideous masks from some dark gallery of death. That was when he looked around and realized how many more had come in. Dozens. Teenage Sith zombies, Tulk thought. How in the moons of Bogdan had it all started? Every so often, the universe must just get bored and decide to really cut loose. Like the corpses that had come after them from the tower, most of them had already started to rot. Others were missing whole pieces of their faces and outer musculature, turning them into walking pathology lessons without the common courtesy to lie down and die. All of them surged forward with the lurching, eager speed of things whose appetite for flesh or for death would never be fully slaked. Tucking his spear into the quiver on his back, Tulk jumped for one of the overhead support struts and swung himself up onto it, shimmying toward the control booth that he'd noticed up there. Anything that could climb to the top of the tower and crawl over the glass would have no problem scrambling up one of these girders, but he had noticed something else up there, and although it probably wasn't enough to tip the battle in his favor, it might give him the edge, and the edge was all he needed. Tulk punched one claw through the booth's viewport, gouging out a hole large enough to drag himself through, and turned around to face the wide, curved instrumentation panel that he assumed controlled the entire training facility below. The dead things were swarming in even more thickly now, crawling all over one another in an attempt to move forward. Some of them had already started trying to grapple their way up into the booth after him. Tulk readied for the simulator controls. What? Found one labeled Swing Arm 17-155 and hit the switch. The simulator responded instantly. Two massive pillars swung down from either side of the ceiling, slamming straight into the swarm of bodies, smashing them aside and sending them flying. Tulk grunted, not entirely satisfied with the result. This wasn't his favorite way to hunt, but the numbers were against him, and he needed every advantage he could marshal in his defense. He activated another sequence, choosing one at random. Slots opened up along the ceiling, spitting loops of razor wire from both sides of the room, stretching out as the things staggered and stumbled and caught themselves, screaming. Tulk glanced back at the controls. The monitor screen to his right was glowing bright green, outlining the entire suite of possibilities for him in a clean, ray-traced diagram, the cursor awaiting its next command. Tulk chose one called Pingy Stick and tapped the execute key. The right half of the floor whipped open, and a spring-loaded row of gleaming hydraulic rods burst up from below, where by all rights they should have rammed the Sith student things straight backward or possibly impaled them through the feet. But something else happened instead. The things jumped back en masse just a split second before the rods had burst up. It was like watching a single prescient organism reacting to a perceived threat. They moved with unbelievable speed and agility, as if they'd known exactly what Tulk was going to do, even before he'd known he was going to do it. Tulk gaped down in disbelief. Are they using the Force? Or their version of it? The question didn't have time to percolate long in his mind. Now the things were swinging up the pendulum arms that Tulk had released, dodging the obstacles from other directions. They knew he was up there and were intent on finishing him. Even the ones that he'd knocked aside had already recovered, and they seemed to have done so with unprecedented speed. Tulk's frown deepened. For the first time in memory, he actually felt his confidence waver. He took a step back, evaluating his options, and felt something strike his shoulder from behind. Pivoting, already prepared to rip apart whatever had snuck up behind him, he saw the bright metallic eyes fixating on him from the chromium casing of their processors. It recoiled with an electronic burble of surprise, and Tolk realized that he was looking at Scabrous' HK protocol droid. "What are you doing up here?" Response: "Excuse me, sir, I certainly didn't mean to disturb you. I'm nearly—" "Shut up." Acknowledgement. The droid's yellow photoreceptors swiveled with recognition. "Tulk the Whiffid?" The droid's vocabulator expressed a mixture of surprise and confusion. "It was my impression that Lord Scabrous already dismissed you quite some time ago. Did you have difficulty finding the exit?" "You could say that, yeah." "Clarification. It's just across the—" The Whiffid let out a low growl, grabbed the droid's arms, and pulled it to the viewport overlooking the simulator below. "Look," he said, pointing. "You see what's down there?" The droid's head pivoted toward the open space below, seething now with hordes of undead Sith students. They were all attempting to scale the support struts, swinging their arms up. The closest ones were near enough now that Tulk could smell them. Response: "Indeed, sir," the droid said dutifully, "but I hardly see what—" "Your boss is the reason why all this went haywire in the first place." Query: "I fail to see why—" "Here's why." Tulk wasn't bothering to look at the HK's photoreceptors anymore. His attention was completely devoted to the components on its breastplate. "You're an HK model." "Confirm." "A Zerka Core HK series." "Yes, sir, but—" "You know what HAT stands for?" Response: "It's an industry term, sir, but—" "Hunter-killer." Oh, I think it says HAT, but I think it's supposed to be an HK there. "Hunter-killer." The droid made a scandalized chirp. "Correction. Respectfully, you're mistaken, sir. I am a protocol droid, proficient in millions of galactic languages, and—" "Zorka built you special to get around local laws banning assassin droids." Tolk was gritting his teeth now. "Those flip shields over your eyes, that's a combat modification. When Scabrous brought you here, he put a restraining bolt on you. But if I do this—" He yanked the bolt off. There was a brief hissing sizzle as the HK's processor muzzle shorted out. Tulk felt his skin tighten, his fur standing on end. He cast a grim look at the droid. "Remember now?" The HK didn't bother to answer. Weapon slots opened on its forearms to reveal an augmented laser array bristling from both limbs. A second later, the control booth came alive with blaster fire. The Sith things recoiled, spun backward, pitched and pivoted off their feet by what appeared to be a non-stop fusillade of hot plasma. Somewhere to the left, Tulk ducked as the HK completed a full circle, laying down a line of fire so fast and dense that it seemed to create a single ballistic wave. He jerked his head back as a laser bolt ricocheted off the wall, then bounced past him in the opposite direction. "Stand aside," the droid said, having apparently abandoned its customary method of speech, along with its former programming. "What—" Its left leg rotated upward to reveal a wider-barreled object extruded from the port. A massive jet of blue flame roared straight across the room, igniting several of the Sith things, and they staggered, blazing, screaming as the flamethrower erupted a second time. Through the sea of burning corpses, Tolk could see a clear corridor to the exit at the back of the simulator. One of the Sith things was slashing its way toward him, jaw sagging hideously, its face on fire. Tolk yanked his spear from where it was still strapped across his back and rammed it as hard as he could into the wide-open mouth. Jerking the spear back, the Whippet glanced in the opposite direction. "Where are you going?" the droid asked. "Back to my ship." Tolk was already halfway across the floor. He turned and looked back at the droid. "You staying here?" Here, with them, the HK didn't hesitate. It followed the Whippet down through the simulation chamber, out of the pain pipe, and into the snow. He found a new friend. Okay, so that's the end of 34. And depending how long this one is, and it seems to be fairly long. Let's see. Okay, it's I'm going to read one more. We'll go ahead and do 35 tonight. So this one is called The Anatomy Lesson. It's cold, Mag said, shivering and looking around as if for verification from the others. Feels good, though, doesn't it, after all that? Kendra didn't say anything. They had just stepped out of the tunnel, she and Mags and Hartwig and Master Hraken silently bringing up the rear. Hartwig had taken Rat's lightsaber, scrubbing the handle with the first handful of snow he could scoop up, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get the stain to go away. Are we going to talk about what happened back there? Mags asked. What? Kendra said. You have something you need to say? They all turned around to look at Hartwig, standing several meters behind them, still inside the tunnel so that half his face remained in darkness. With Rat, Mags said. Rat got turned, Hartwig said, emerging into the vague gray glow of the twilight air, breath pluming from his lips. It was the first time he'd spoken since they'd chopped their way through the barrier, and his voice sounded different, thick and strange. He changed into one of them, and Master Hraken boxed him. And I got his lightsaber. End of story. What about us? Mags asked. None of us was bitten, as far as I can tell. Hartwig looked around as if waiting to see if the others would contradict him. You okay? Mags nodded. Kendra? You have something you need to come clean about? She didn't look around. Kendra? Silence. Hey! Hartwig walked over, pushing past Mags and grabbing her shoulder, swinging her hard toward him. I'm talking to you. Kendra snapped around on him, her eyes brittle pellets. I'm clean. You sure? Hartwig hadn't lowered his hands. What's that on your neck? Very funny. You think I'm joking? He waited while Kendra reached up and touched her throat, perhaps a centimeter lateral to the jugular. She winced as the open wound drew back her. She winced at the open wound, drew back her hand, and looked at the scarlet stain on her index finger. Standing apart from them, a little distance away, Master Hraken watched without saying anything. Just a cut, she said. A piece of the electrical fixture. You don't know that, Hartwig said. You don't think I'd remember being bitten? I think, he held her gaze, that there was a lot of infected blood flying around, and if some of it splashed in there, then I'd already be screaming and ripping your guts out, Kendra snapped. Which I'm not, no matter how much I'd like to, so if you're done casting baseless aspersions. You were ready to kill me back there over a lightsaber, Hartwig said. Seems to me that it's in the group's best interest if we took you out of the equation now. He glanced at the Sith Master. Right, Master Hraken? Hraken didn't have a chance to reply before Kendra cut in again. Is this really what you want? She asked Hartwig, blade ready. We've sparred enough times in the training arena. You know how it's going to go down. Hartwig didn't answer, just stared at her, shoulders rising and falling with every breath, his face betraying no trace of emotion. The wind flung another thin gust of snow between them, and Kendra felt the cut beginning to ache on her throat. Make a move, she said. You first. Wait, Meg said. Nobody knows what the incubation period of this thing is, right? Hartwig didn't take his eyes off Kendra. Seemed pretty fast with Rat. Yeah, but Rat got tagged firsthand. Maybe accidental exposure takes longer. Kendra could hear Mag's voice growing more confident as he spoke, warming to his own argument. Point is, we don't know. So before somebody does something stupid, how about we all take a step back, strip down, and make sure nobody's got any open cuts that could have gotten contaminated blood in them? He looked back at Combat Master Kraken, who still had not spoken. What do you think? Kraken nodded. Yes, he said. Stripped down? Kendra's expression had already gone from bellicose to incredulous. You're asking me to take my clothes off? It's not the only way to be sure. It's the only way to be sure. He glanced at Hartwig. You agree to that? Why not? Hartwig shrugged. I've got nothing to hide. He yanked off his tunic and the uniform shirt beneath it, then shoved his pants down to his ankles. In front of him, Kendra had already slipped out of her coat, keeping her bare arms across her chest, gazing back defiantly at the others. That's as far as I'm going. Hartwig rolled his eyes and turned back to Mags, who stood shivering in his shorts and boots, clutching a wad of balled-up clothes against him like a small child that had gone to sleep. Behind him, bare-chested, stood Master Kraken. The combat master had also stripped to the waist, but without being asked, revealing a broad, well-muscled physique hardened by scar tissue, strange tattoos, and the decades of intense physical conditioning. His head was bowed as if he was inspecting something in the snow. Looks like we're all clean, Hartwig said, so I guess that means we... Master Kraken raised his head. The crooked slash of his grin on his face seemed to cut almost diagonally across the entire width of his head. Blood had already started streaming down one side of his mouth where he'd gnawed his own lips open. There was nothing human in his eyes. With a shapeless noise that was half shout, half gasp, Hartwig fumbled for his lightsaber and dropped it in the snow. He bent down, scrambling to pick it up, but succeeded only in pushing it deeper. In less than a second, Kraken was on him. He grabbed Hartwig's head and buried his teeth in the student's throat, ripping out a mouthful of tissue and cartilage. Kendra watched wild, looping parabolas of blood spurting high in the air around him like a miniature fountain that had been turned on directly beneath Hartwig's chin. Hartwig staggered backward, hands up, blinking at the Sith Master as he whipped around to face him. His nerves were gone. Kraken's hands flew up, preparing to fire off a burst of force lightning, when its head toppled sideways off its shoulders and rolled, still spurting, into the dark snowdrifts. Kraken's decapitated body collapsed, seizing and twitching, and Mag saw Kendra standing behind it. She gripped the lightsaber in both hands with absolute steadiness. Thanks, Mags breathed. Forget it. She walked over to Kraken's still snarling head and chopped it straight down the middle. That one's all yours. Mags looked back around at Hartwig's corpse. Its ripped open throat spilled out sloppily across the snow like a losing hand of Pazak. The thing was already starting to come back. It was squirming in place, shifting its arms and legs, preparing to sit up again. Listless, bubbling and gurgling sounds issued from the hole in its neck. You going to take care of it? Kendra asked. Mags took a breath and swung his own lightsaber down on Hartwig's corpse, carved its torso open from throat to groin. Gazing down at him, Kendra realized she could see the black, still pulsing gristle of the thing's dead heart laboring stupidly onward, grasping for one more beat. What she felt more than anything at that moment was revulsion at the human machine's mindless commitment to endure and endure and endure. Is it down? She asked. Mags didn't answer. Is it down? Mags went to work with the lightsaber again, and this time it took the Hartwig thing's head off it at the shoulders. The head dangled for a moment on one remaining ribbon of flesh, then dropped away. A few listless dribbles of boiled blood leaked like tears from the seared-off arteries, black as used oil, before they cauterized completely. Now it's down, he said. Kendra nodded, but kept her own lightsaber drawn. What now? Mags asked. I'm leaving, she said. You're staying here. Mags blinked. What? Kendra's lightsaber slashed out from the back, catching him across the hamstrings, shearing through tendons just above the ankle. Mag shrieked and slipped, arms pinwheeling, all balance gone. He was screaming at her, asking her why she did it. What did she think she was doing? But by that time, Kendra had already turned and started running, not walking, but running as fast as she could in the opposite direction. Wait! Mags sat up and tried to stand, but his lower legs refused the job. The severed Achilles tendons dumping him forward again into the snow. When he lifted his head up, he heard the noises coming up from behind him. No, Mags thought. No, this was all a mistake. Just a big mistake. He looked back, and they fell on him. There you go. So we'll pick up at 36 next time. And call it there for that reading session. Let's see, who's around? Nobody's on right now? I mean, nobody I want to go. I follow some people that I don't ever watch that are doing like D&D streams and stuff that I'm so far behind. I don't know what's going on, so I don't watch them. Um, yeah, I'm not really. There's nobody. Okay, well, we'll just call it a session there then, and I will see you maybe tomorrow night if I can get my game going. I've been having some issues with it. My new game. I'm going to play some Fallout New Vegas. So, all right. See you next time.